Shalom, dear friends, we're back on air. I greet all of you, welcome, and thank you for tuning in. We'll take a look at one of the most important topics, the topic of the diaspora, that is, the first steps of survival after the year 70. Where did the Jews go? Why did they scatter? The refugees, the beginnings of the center in Yavne under Rabbi Gamaliel, who presided in Yavne and received permission from the Romans. To restore the Sanhedrin not in Jerusalem, but in Yavne, the beginning of the canonization of the oral tradition, what was preserved, and how to live now without the temple. All these questions, friends, we will study next week. But today, we are talking about the consequences of the spiritual collapse. Specifically, we will look inside at what those consequences were. Yesterday, we talked about the splendor of the Second Temple. We discussed just how truly beautiful and magnificent it was. I even showed you a video, not just an animation, where you were supposed to see all the grandeur of the Second Temple, its architecture, its wealth, its decoration, and the enormous amount of gold that adorned this temple. And indeed, those who saw the Second Temple after it was rebuilt by Herod, by Hortus, were truly amazed. It was truly a wonder of the world. It was a wonder of the world, but all of it turned into this. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and about the fact that what has happened and what is happening now is very concerning. So, my friends, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the like button, ring the bell, and all those other buttons you know you need to press. We're studying the history of Israel, Jewish history. This is a very important course that will last in Israel for a whole year, as long as I'm able to do it. Every day, the Creator gives us the breath of life and everything necessary for living. So, we'll take things one day at a time without getting too far ahead of ourselves. Today, of course, we'll focus on the immediate, shocking, and catastrophic consequences. Consequences that struck the Jewish people, the entire land of Israel, the whole diaspora, and every Jew right after the year 70 CE. We'll talk about the plundering and destruction, about the fate of the captives. We'll discuss the imposition of humiliating taxes, the rise of anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire, and what remained of the once thriving Jewish community. From what was once a flourishing city of pilgrims, after the year 70, the city turned into a city of tears and ruins. It was impossible to describe this. Everyone who witnessed what happened was shocked. You can't even call it a deep shock. That's how much it shook the entire Jewish world. Just imagine Jerusalem after the Roman legions left. The city that was the joy of the whole earth, as it says in Tehillim, Psalm 48, verse 3. Now this city lay in ruins. The temple, which Josephus Flavius described as having an appearance that could astonish the mind and the imagination. On all sides, the temple was covered with massive gold plates, and when the first rays of the sun hit it, it shone with such a bright brilliance that it made people turn their eyes away from the sunlight. Now all of this has been reduced to ashes and piles of stones. The streets, which were once full of pilgrims, were now empty, strewn with bodies that could not be buried. To describe the significance of this is unbearably painful even in modern words. And what happened in those times, those distant times, was the collapse of everything. Josephus Flavius, whose works we are reading these days and looking into, was a witness to these events. In his work, The Jewish War, he describes the horrors of the siege, unbearable hunger, epidemics, and internal strife. Among the Jewish defenders, who were themselves further weakened, the city from within, the ruthless cruelty of the Roman soldiers. Josephus Flavius conveys to us the despair of the defenders, the mercilessness of the conquerors. His testimony is a cry from the soul, a document of unimaginable suffering. And to everyone who wants to study history, to everyone who wants to know the truth, I advise you to download Josephus Flavius's book, The Jewish War. It's available in an absolutely accessible format. I think it's even in our library on Telegram. According to Flavius's estimates, millions of people died during the siege and assault. It was unbearable to imagine millions of people perishing in Israel back then. It was even impossible. It's impossible even today. But today's Israel is 10 times larger than it was back then. So even back then, those numbers were simply unbearable, enormous. The fate of the captured Jews was horrifying, absolutely horrifying. They were driven in columns along the roads of Judea, then sent to Rome and other parts of the empire. Crucified people hung along all the roads. Crucified people hung along all the roads. Jews were crucified for every offense, executed for any attempt at resistance. Now the Jews were considered enemies of Rome. They were seen as rebels. Those who were taken into slavery were sent to do hard labor in the mines and were also forced to fight in the gladiatorial arenas. But that's not all. The most public and humiliating symbol of Judea's defeat was Titus's triumph in Rome. It's impossible to describe. I don't even have any images to show you except for the depiction on the second arch of Titus, where to this day in Rome you can see how the temple vessels, the menorah, and various other artifacts are being carried because Titus, he organized a demonstrative procession. At the front, he led the Jewish slaves and prisoners he had captured. They were taken and selected from among all the captives. The healthiest and strongest young men were chosen for battles in the gladiatorial arenas. At this grand celebration, at this magnificent parade immortalized on the Arch of Titus, of course, the captured trophies from the Jerusalem temple were displayed. Right here you can see the depiction of the menorah, the tables, and the showbread. The offerings and other sacred objects that were carried by the Roman soldiers. It's hard to even imagine desecration like this. The sacred vessels, which had been set apart for service, were defiled, and now they were carried as trophies won in the shameful war of Judea against Rome. This was not only an act of demonstrating military might, it was an act of symbolic subjugation of the Jewish God. It wasn't just Rome conquering some nation. No, this was the subjugation of God and his people. It was a public humiliation meant to crush any spirit of resistance. Absolutely any spirit. Break time equals 0.5s / the sacred menorah, meticulously crafted from pure, gleaming gold and profoundly embodying a pure, divine meaning, now tragically became the ill-gotten property of utterly ruthless and barbaric pagans. And to this day, all these trophies are in Babylon, that is, in Babylon. All these trophies are in the Vatican. And the Vatican is in no hurry to give them back to Israel. And I think maybe they can't give them back. Or maybe they just don't want to. But who knows? Maybe Israel will reach a point where it simply takes its trophies back. After the destruction of the temple, the Roman Empire imposed a special, extremely humiliating tax on the Jews. It was called the Fiscus Judaicus. This tax replaced the annual temple tax, which every Jew was required to pay for the upkeep of the Jerusalem temple. This is even written in the book of Exodus, chapter 30, verse 13. Now, however, these funds no longer went to the sanctuary, but to the maintenance of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. This was an act of symbolic subjugation and religious insult. In general, the Romans believed that in order to truly conquer a people, first and foremost, you had to humiliate their gods and conquer their religion. The Romans knew that simply conquering a people with military might was not enough. It is impossible to subjugate people without subjugating their inner spiritual core. That is why Rome was engaged not only in occupation, physically, but also in practically changing the very essence of a people, the very essence of individuals. This was an act of symbolic subjugation, a religious insult. Imagine the money that used to go towards serving the one God was now being used to support a pagan cult, the Temple of Jupiter. Can you imagine? Every Jew was required to give their money to maintain the Temple of Jupiter. It was a constant, painful reminder of their own defeat. The destruction of Jerusalem and the suppression of the revolt led to a complete economic collapse in Judea. There was famine in Judea, a total economic collapse. Farmlands were devastated, cities were destroyed and burned. Significant territories were confiscated by the Roman emperor and became imperial property. And the surviving Jews often had to become tenants on their own former land, paying taxes to Rome. In other words, by capturing the cities, they seized the land. They seized the land, and the land they took, you could keep living on it, but now you became a tenant on your own land, which, of course, only made things worse. Poverty and despair. On top of all that, there was a rise in anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire. This was a new kind of fear, one that Jews hadn't known for a very long time. They had been living quite well in all the cities of the Roman province. We know about Jewish communities. We read about them even in the book of Acts. We know about the Jewish communities in Rome. There was a community of 50,000 people. We know about the Jewish communities in Antioch. Why do we know about the Jewish communities in Antioch? We read about it in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 11, when the disciples came to Antioch and preached to no one except the Jews. Antioch was a large and important city, a major artery of trade. This was a new kind of fear. The rise of anti-Semitism was off the charts, which led to a rejection of the Jewish component of the way. And even those Messianic communities that were established by the apostles could no longer support Jerusalem as they had before. For example, in that same chapter 11 of the Acts of the Apostles, when the prophet Agabus stood up and proclaimed a great famine throughout the land, and then they gathered an offering, a donation for Jerusalem. That's basically what Paul was doing throughout all his journeys. He was always collecting donations for Jerusalem. For Jerusalem. So, the situation was difficult. And now there was a complete famine. But more than that, the point isn't even just this. Now, every person in the Roman Empire who maintained ties with Israel, with the Jews, and the Jews themselves, were now considered a subjugated, oppressed people. And now they were seen as enemies of Rome and enemies of Caesar. That's what really started to happen. Excuse me, we're only talking about the year 70. We haven't even reached the year 135 yet, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the times of Rabbi Akiva, when all of Israel was dug up completely and nothing was left. What happened back then was total fear and horror. Today, we're only at the beginning of that fear. For now, we're only talking about the start of all this, the path. But nevertheless, many Roman and Greek bishops, that is, the elders of these communities who followed the Jewish way, faced threats to their own lives, and many turned away from this path, returning to philosophical Greco-Roman practices. And they began to seriously consider Gnosticism and all Gnostic approaches instead of the traditional Jewish ones. Many abandoned the Jewish holidays, Shabbat, and the commandments of the Torah, and essentially played along with the Roman and Greek way of life. Step by step, slowly, the Jewish component was dissolving. In the Roman environment, there were no Jews left at all, there were no more Jewish bishops, and all the leaders were Romans. This completely removed everyone from the perspective of Jewish wisdom. So it's no surprise, really, that after 100, 200, 300 years, all of this led us to the book. But we will talk about all these things because everything that happened did not happen out of nowhere. All these events, step by step, inch by inch, lead us to where we end up. Anti-Jewish sentiments were spreading throughout the entire Roman Empire. The Jews, who already stood out because of their monotheism and their refusal to worship the emperor, which was mandatory, worshiping the emperor was required. Both taxes to the emperor and taxes to Jupiter were obligatory. The Jews stood out by refusing to do this and by their monotheism. They also stood out because of their unique dietary laws. All of them were now seen as a rebellious, stubborn, disloyal people, enemies of the regime, foreign agents. Roman propaganda portrayed the Jews as a threat to the stability of the empire. My friends, there is nothing new under the sun, absolutely nothing. Conspiracies and conspiracy theories were being spun. They were already starting to exist on a very, very large scale. Jews were now being called enemies of humanity, haters of the Roman gods, who were to be revered. All of this, of course, created an atmosphere of fear and hostility toward Jewish communities, and all Jewish communities around the world, everywhere, lived in fear and in anticipation of extermination. Do you think this isn't happening today? It is happening because today I read that all Jewish rabbis and, in general, Jews in Iran, and there are Jews in Iran, there are even rabbis in Iran, have been arrested. Now they will be accused of collaborating with the Jewish Mossad and with Israel. Now a huge wave of hatred will be poured out on them, and it's quite possible that they'll be the ones people take it out on. But really, what was stopping them from leaving? It was possible they could have left through Azerbaijan and through the countries bordering Iran. But now it's too late. This has always happened. It's happening right now, right today, after thousands and thousands of years. All the communities that were outside Judea now found themselves in danger for their lives. They had no center. Without the temple, without a central capital, the Jewish people were left completely disoriented. This caused a deep existential crisis, a profound sense of abandonment. Now, how do you exist without a center, without the temple, without the established sacrifices that were the cornerstone of worship? How are we supposed to observe Passover now? How do we observe Shabu? How do we live? And Sukkot? What are we supposed to do with all of this now? How do you live without a heart? Can a person live without a heart? That's a very interesting question. After the year 70, Judea became a desolate, much less populated province, or rather, a province of Rome, no longer a state. Many cities and settlements were completely destroyed. The Roman presence, including the military, increased significantly. The 10th Legion was permanently stationed in Jerusalem, which had now become a Roman camp. And on the Temple Mount, they set up a military base where they also built a cult site for the worship of Jupiter, raised the flags of Rome, and so on. Formally, the province of Judea remained as such, and the Romans gradually began to use a new name, Syria Palestina, for this very category. But not today. We'll talk about all of this when we get to the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's when Israel was renamed to Palestine. That's Philistia. This was done in an attempt to erase all identity of the land of Israel, to remove even its name, its God, and everything associated with it. So why are you surprised by what happened in 325 when Emperor Constantine simply did what was already obvious, removing the Jewish calendar, erasing all Jewish elements, and even the Jewish God, establishing a new deity? Constantine, who was a pagan and remained a pagan, who at the end of his life declared himself the 13th apostle, wore a ridiculous wig on his head and huge golden robes, flaunted his paganism, a murderer who killed and wiped out his entire family. This man has now been elevated to the status of a righteous figure. It's actually laughable. Only the ignorant, those who don't study history, can believe this. But we are not from here. We are from the land of Israel, and we know this truth and will speak it. All that remains of Jerusalem itself are ruins and, of course, part of the western wall of the Temple Mount, now famously known as the Western Wall. It has become a symbol of loss and enduring hope. That's why every Jew knows, when they come here, the first place they go, the very first place they go, is to the Western Wall. This is the very place that draws his heart. I can't explain it to you, but that's just how it is. The Romans built their military camps on the ruins of the temple, and for ordinary Jews, living in Jerusalem was almost completely forbidden. All the other strict laws forbidding living in and returning to Israel, we'll study those together after Bar Kokhba, when Jews were completely banned from living in the land of Israel. But, nevertheless, there was always a Jewish presence in Israel, and there was always a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. Even though Jerusalem was under different empires, the Jewish presence there never ended. Even in ruins, Jerusalem remained a holy city. It turns out Jerusalem is more than just a city. And it turns out Jerusalem is more than just a building. It turns out that even a destroyed Jerusalem, even if there isn't a single building left and it's just an empty field, Jerusalem still won't leave the Jewish heart. This is what our enemies, the conquerors, and what the Romans didn't really understand. They thought that by wiping out Jerusalem and burning the temple, they would basically destroy the very center and heart of Jewish worship, and that as a result, the Jews would simply become Romans, not realizing that Jerusalem is more than just a building, more than just stones, and even more than the temple itself. Jerusalem itself is a kind of spiritual and mystical force that always resides in the heart, even though many people have never seen it physically. Even in ruins, Jerusalem remained a holy city because Jews always directed their prayers toward it, turned to face it wherever they were, and offered their prayers to it. The destruction of the temple, of course, intensified Messianic expectations. Many believed that the Messiah would come to restore the temple and put an end to suffering. And in the section Sanhedrin it is written, the Messiah will come in the generation in which the temple is destroyed. This expresses the hope for imminent deliverance, which, of course, brings us to Bar Kokhba, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the slave uprising in general to the era of Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Messianic expectations at that time were off the charts. The Jews wanted to see a Messiah because that Messiah, Yeshua, in whom they believed and whom they accepted, thousands of Jews accepted Yeshua. Now he had become the leader of the Greeks and Romans. Now those who were involved with the communities in Antioch, Alexandria, and various other places had turned away from the Torah. The Jews concluded, if they have turned away from the Torah, then this Messiah is not ours. That's how important the Torah is in the heart of a Jew. I am sure that if it weren't for all these events, in the end the Jewish community would have continued to grow, and Mashiach Yeshua would have been closely woven into the entire system of Judaism and Jewish worship. I don't even see any obstacles to this, or even any doubts about it. That's exactly how it would have been if the Jews hadn't seen that those who claimed to be his disciples, his leaders, his guides, had turned away from the commandments of the Torah, had abandoned Shabbat and all the other things. Nevertheless, the Jewish path and the Messianic path, and even the Romans, Greeks, who accepted the Mashiach, many of them lived in agreement with the concept of the one Creator and the understanding of Shema Yisrael. We'll talk about this with you as well. All these movements persisted right up until the year 325, before they were declared heretical. But even after they were declared heretical, they still existed in this world and didn't disappear anywhere, even to this very day. This is confirmed and explained to us by scientific research and the scholarly work of historians, biblical scholars, textual critics, and scholars of religion. So, a new center. The new center can no longer be Jerusalem. Now, the new center becomes Yavne. Yavne is a tiny, tiny, tiny little town. Even today, it's a very small town not far from Ashdod. Between Ashdod and Rishon LeZion, there is a small town called Yavne. I don't know how many thousands of people live there. That's it. But it was Yavne that became the center of Jewish life. Those who survived and were not taken into slavery were forced to seek refuge elsewhere. This accelerated the process of the diaspora, Jews dispersed throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. We will talk about Yavne next week, about Rabbi Gamliel and the creation of the Sanhedrin, the new Sanhedrin, which was very important. New centers of Jewish life begin to form, communities in Alexandria, in Antioch, and in Babylon itself. We will talk about all these communities in the upcoming lessons. These communities will become the foundation for the survival of the Jewish people. The Babylonian Talmud will be written in Babylon. Babylon was not always hostile, and at certain points in history, it was even a home for the Jewish diaspora. Everything we are studying today, we are not just learning dates. We are not just learning dates. We are studying the profound events that take place in our history. These are huge, bleeding wounds that teach us and accompany us throughout all the days and years of our lives. Angelica, thank you. May the Almighty bless you. Shabbat Shalom. From a time of utter devastation, slavery, humiliating taxes, growing anti-Semitism, when the land of Israel was completely ravaged and Jerusalem lay in ruins, when it seemed there was no hope left. And it seemed as if the very heart had been torn out by the roots, by the roots. Nevertheless, in this utter darkness, we see a spark of hope flickering. Messianic expectations grow stronger, and the memories of the temple have not disappeared. And it turns out that even a burned temple and even a devastated Jerusalem remain a center of attraction. And even a single small wall that remained after the temple still holds enormous significance for the entire Jewish world. In the next series of lessons, we will see how the people of Israel, despite all the unimaginable losses, found the strength to adapt, how faith was re-examined from temple-based to synagogue life, and how a new reality began to be built without the temple and without a central point. How the Messianic community developed during this difficult period, what factors influenced it, what was being reinterpreted there as well, and how, little by little, Greek thinking began to take over this path. Yet, nevertheless, there remain groups that continue to follow the Jewish way, the laws of the Torah, Shabbat, and Jewish traditions. We will talk with you about all these things, about life in Alexandria, about life in Antioch, about life in Babylon. We will talk with you about a new fear, about the idea that the Jews are punished forever, in fact, and now exiled by God. Now, in reality, it turns out that they are rejected by God. We will continue to talk about early anti-Semitism, which was building up at that time, and it was not just anti-Semitism anymore, it was already anti-Zionism, which we are only encountering today. But back then, it already existed in full force. We will talk with you about what happened to Yeshua's disciples after the year 70, what happened to the Jewish communities who believed in the Messiah, how they reformed and how they structured themselves, how they celebrated Passover when there was no longer Jerusalem, and James the brother was also gone, as he too had been killed. How the conflict with the rabbis happened, that is, with Rabbinic Judaism. and how they had to choose between faith in the Torah or faith in Greco-Roman philosophy. Now we have a distinction between Yeshua and Christ, which became the beginning of the break in these relationships. We will study all these most important things together with you. We will talk with you about the early communities of believers from among the nations, and we will discuss Paul's message. Is his legacy still alive? We will talk about who the Nazarenes and Ebionites were, who the Gnostics and Hellenists were, and what the Didache is, the first non-canonical text of the Church. Why is this so? Why is there an issue of identity? And so on and so forth. Until we reach the year 132. The years 132 to 135, Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba. The uprising. Why did it start? What was Rabbi Akiva's role? Why did Rabbi Akiva proclaim Bar Kokhba as the Mashiach ben Kasiba or ben Kozba? What happened to him? Why were the hopes for the salvation of the Messiah off the charts against the backdrop of total collapse? What happened during this greatest Jewish uprising? The second time there was an uprising. That was when there was mass death, when there was absolute exile and the final diaspora. Judea was already reassigned and renamed Palestine. That was already the end, and a new hope, and so on and so forth. My friends, this whole tragic story is full of a very complicated path, but at the same time, an important one in which we will study all its components. So don't tune out, don't go too far away. Let's stay in touch. Adina writes, so, does it mean that the Shekhinah did not leave Jerusalem after its fall and remains to this day, despite all the centuries long? Of course not. The Shekhinah left together with the people of Israel. Wherever the Jews went, the Shekhinah went too. But Jerusalem remained at the center. That's why, on Passover, wherever Jews were, in whatever countries of exile or diaspora, they always said, next year in Jerusalem. It didn't matter who ruled Jerusalem or who possessed it. In Jewish self-awareness, Jerusalem was always a part of Israel. Did the Turks rule it? Did the British rule it? Did the Crusaders rule it? No matter who ruled it, the Shekinah was with the people. It was with the houses of prayer. It was with the houses of study. It was with the Beit Midrash, the Jewish schools. The Shekinah was wherever the people were. We will talk about all these things with you and continue our long and painstaking journey. I wish you all blessings.